Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I am your host, Alan Moore, and thank you so much for joining me today. Today is an interview with Blane Warrene, who is currently the COO of MobileGuard, a text message archiving solution. But he was previously the founder of Arcovi, the social media archiving solution. So Blane has spent most of his career in financial technology and is really the leading expert on data security, archiving, encryption, and more for financial advisors. And today we talk about all three. So we started with a discussion on what data needs to be archived and what solutions exist to help with this process. We then talked about how to manage data backups and backups of the backups to be sure you're protected. And then we discussed how to encrypt your data and data entry points like your cell phone or your laptop. So as you can tell, we cover a bunch of ground in this episode, but at each step of the way, Blane gives recommendations for various systems to look at. So I'm confident he'll equip you with everything you need. Now you can access the show notes and additional resources at xyplanningnetwork.com/43. And be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP, as this is actually an interview that came directly out of a request in the VIP community for this topic. So without further ado, here's the interview with Blane Warrene. Hey, Blane, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being on.
Thanks, Alan. Great to be here.
You know, we get so many questions from members of our VIP community. I swear that probably one of the hottest topics right now is around data security, encryption, everything that's going on right now coming from the state regulators and FINRA and Anonymous, the hacker group hacking all these various companies. And it's just kind of interesting to see. And so we had a lot of questions around like, who can talk to us about this? And you are the go-to expert. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be on today to talk us through just some various topics I think that are a major concern right now for financial planning firms, particularly smaller firms that don't have entire IT departments. So thanks again.
Oh, no problem. And congratulations on the amazing growth of the network. So you're doing some great things.
Thank you. It's been a ton of fun. We just crossed that 200 member mark and things seem to keep going. And these are the types of problems I think that we want to help our members as well as just listeners in general solve. And it's questions that are hard to get answers to. I mean, you can't call the state regulator and say like, hey, you know, what level of encryption do I need and what software do I use? And by the way, what is encryption? Because they really can't answer those questions. So, but before we kind of jump into specifics and really digging in, I just want to hear a little bit about your background because it's always fascinating to hear how someone gets into being a data security expert for financial advisors. So could you give us kind of a synopsis on your career path up until this point?
Sure. No, I'd be glad to. And I'll keep it short, of course, so nobody suffers through the history. But I came into technology in the early 90s. I was actually a sous chef when I was very young. It's in my family and I was trained to do so. But I kept bumping into people who were having success getting into technology jobs in the early 90s. And I quickly learned about the much more appealing work schedule of an IT person versus a chef. And having a young family, I was drawn to it. I attached to technology almost immediately. And I was also exposed pretty quickly to financial services. And while it was like most people, when they first meet the financial services industry, they're very confused by the acronyms and the exceptions and the rules. Once you get into it, if you love it, I found that you never leave it. And I joined the industry in the mid 90s in what was to become a part of ING, Vestac Securities. And it was also probably the most important employer I ever had, Jack Conley, as a CEO. He gave me a chance when I was going up against people with much more credibility and qualifications. He took a bet on me. And that influenced the rest of my career, seeing how he managed and ran his business. And so that kept me not only in technology, but in the space that served financial advisors. And I progressively worked myself through roles related to project management and technology, and ultimately as a CIO inside of that ING network of BDs, and with firms like Pacific Life, with CBiz and Valmark Securities. And as I got deeper into my career in the 2000s, I really started to embrace more progressive technology, the emergence of social media, the emergence of web and app technology. And that's when I kind of transitioned to becoming a startup creator. Of course, I created Warrene with Neil Kwan, which is still running today. And Neil does a great job over there as the chief. And I also had started Arcovy, which was a social media archiving solution that served the financial markets. That ultimately was sold to Reg Ed back in 2012. And now I still serve on the board of Warrene, but I've joined MobileGuard as their COO, which is a mobile compliance suite that works in financial services, among other industries. And so I keep finding ways to make sure that I can keep my brain and my spirit in financial services, which is really where my passion is.
And really kind of merging technology, data, and financial services kind of all under one roof, which is really awesome.
Yeah, and that's really where the security component came in, is just by nature of being in information technology with broker-dealers. That was always at the top of mind and forefront when you were sorting out how to manage technology and deploy it in the field. But it was really social media that got me immensely interested in privacy and data security. And so I really focused since 2009, basically the last 7 years, I've spent thinking more and more about cybersecurity. And I find that I'm speaking about it more and more month over month to financial advisors.
So Warrene, what was that company and what did y'all do and what are y'all doing these days?
Sure. So Warrene serves financial advisors and provides basically a due diligence platform for advisors to determine what's the best technology that they should acquire, how they should most effectively use it, and how they can get the most return on investment. And the way I love Neil's description, he says, as you are fee-only advisors to your clients, we are fee-only advisors to advisors about technology. So Warrene doesn't get paid by vendors or by other providers. We get paid by the financial advisors to give them expert advice on how to use technology.
And then you said you started Arcovy, which listeners may know that we actually, and this was after the sale of Arcovy to Reg Ed, we actually provide Arcovy for social media compliance to all of our members, which I think is actually how I first came across you, was your work there. But what kind of inspired you to start Arcovy? I mean, what was the underlying purpose there? Did you just see a market opportunity or anything in particular?
Well, in 2008, we were a dear friend of mine, Carl Klein, who's a compliance attorney and counsel in financial services. We were working at CBiz together, and we were fascinated with the fact that companies were trying to grapple with LinkedIn, which at the time was probably the most emergent social platform in financial services, albeit early. But folks were trying to find ways to use it. It was a natural place to connect and find intersections. And internally to large organizations, there was just no clear path. And it was driven by the fact that organizations knew they needed to archive the data. Nobody was doing it. So we went into the garage and built Arcovy in 2009. And what was ironic is we launched within 12 days of socialware, and neither of us knew that we were building and launching at the same time, literally within 9 days of 12 days of one another, I think it was. In 2009, we launched and went into beta. And I met a lot of who I consider dear friends today through that beta period, where a lot of early adopters, financial advisors and others in the industry approached me and said, wow, we'll take this for a spin. A lot of small firms. And so it really drove us with a lot of energy to build it out.
You know, and when we start talking about data in general, and obviously everything is data driven, especially in this day and age, and everything, is sitting on a computer somewhere, it seems. I think we're talking about a couple of different components. And it sounds like, your background, you've been involved on the technology side, you've been on the archiving side with MobileGuard. I believe that is also on the archiving side for mobile solutions. But what we're going to be talking about today, I feel like, is kind of a couple of different areas. One is compliance. And we have some very vague rules, some very specific that were written a very long time ago around what we actually have to archive. And I know interpretations of those rules are different depending on who you ask. No two compliance people ever seem to have the same opinion about anything.
That's for sure.
It's like talking to lawyers. And so, what does, from a regulatory standpoint, what do we have to do? And then we have actual backups. And this is good business practice. What should we be doing with our data? Where should we be backing it up? What does that even mean? And then we have data protection, being how do we stop other people from accessing our data? Does that sound about right? I mean, are those kind of the three areas that we're looking at when we're talking about just kind of good business practices?
Absolutely. Those are the three core layers, communications that you produce or create or engage in, general data that you create in the course of running and managing your business, which of course goes well beyond marketing or general communications. And then finally, the security aspect. And those are three different tiers. And in most cases, there's not a Swiss Army knife for it, meaning that you have three different solutions to grapple with, even as a small firm, let alone being a large firm.
Yeah, and sometimes you end up with multiple solutions for each of those tiers. I mean, and I think that's what can be a little overwhelming. It's like paralysis by choice whenever you look at all of the systems that are out there. And in really all three of these, not very many systems are specifically catered towards financial advisors, many which we'll talk about some specifics later on, but many probably work for financial advisors. But Google with their Google Vault email archiving, they're not out trying to court financial advisors. We're too small of a marketplace. They're not trying to prove to us Google Vault works for us. And so people go, well, they don't really advertise to us, so maybe it doesn't work for us, so let's go find a specific solution. So it's just kind of an overwhelming conversation to wade into. So maybe the easiest thing is just start with archiving. And so, I guess for listeners, especially our younger listeners that may be kind of getting into the industry and don't know all of our archiving needs or desires, where does our need of archiving even come from? I mean, who decided that we need to archive emails or social media profiles or anything like that?
Well, sure. It really spans from the SEC, which is a trickle-down effect. Most of the states adopt the same level of protocol as the SEC, and then sometimes can amplify or modify based on special markets. So New York, for example, in the insurance market, or the Northeast corridor, some of those states have very specialized additions to the rules related to insurance to go along with securities. California, that can be regulatory driven, meaning the business models in those areas. It can also be politically driven, where there's just different political preferences, and the headwinds of regulatory preferences play a role as well. So it can get a little complicated with what drives it. It emerges from the SEC and trickles down. FINRA either adopts and modifies the SEC rules for registered persons, or they often will propose modifications that get approved and then made available to FINRA to use with the organizations they supervise. So that's kind of at a million feet. That's where those rules come from. And then from a practical standpoint, a day-to-day standpoint, the state securities divisions are what help perfect what organizations truly need to capture as business changes. And so they're often the first on the ground to see or sense the changes, and that trickles its way up the ladder back to the regulators in Washington and New York. Bottom line, what we have today in our industry, and especially pertinent to your listeners, is we have communications with our clients or correspondence in any electronic form, whether it's private or public, needs to be captured and stored in some way or another. That can range anything from literally a letter or an email to social posts that are group related, or even just public tweets. They all fall into a couple of categories, but they're electronic communications that need to be archived. There's a secondary layer that spills over into the day-to-day business. So that kind of the documents and reports, we run reports for our clients. They access things in portals. Those documents that become presentations to clients, whether they're internal and confidential or external and marketing oriented, that's also a layer of retention that we need to keep. And then there's kind of an ancillary area, things like advisors that write articles in newspapers or on blogs, public speeches, which, believe it or not, people are still giving speeches. I give about a speech a month. I get invited to give a speech where it's not necessarily a presentation, but it's a topic. And right now, 99% of those are cybersecurity. But that business layer of documents spills over into our day-to-day. That's where the backup comes in. Right. So there's archiving for email and electronic communications that go outbound to the public. And then there's just a document retention. And sometimes there's a lot of a focus on, hey, we got to have a real bulletproof, compliant archiving tool, but not as much thought is given to the capacity or the complexity of just general backups.
Right.
Are they running effectively? And can you verify that they'll always work for you when you need them?
So essentially, when it comes to archiving, it sounds like it can be summed up in any time you're communicating really anything electronically, you need to be capturing that somewhere. You've got to have a record of it. And as someone who has been audited before by a very nice state regulator, they basically came in and said, we want to see all emails sent from August 1st to August 7th, 2013. Show us a record of that. And if I remember correctly, they wanted it in uneditable PDF format. I mean, it was pretty specific. So what are I guess whenever advisors are looking at archiving solutions, particularly those outside of financial services and don't necessarily know our lingo, what are the general retention rules that the SEC is pushing out, recognizing that each state may be a little bit further, they may have a little bit stricter rules?
Sure. It comes in three parts. One is they want you to archive all those communications that we just covered and capture them. So that's step one. Step two is you need to be able to categorize and review or supervise those communications in the event that you need to validate your policies and procedures for compliance with a regulator or an examiner. And then the third is the way in which you must store them and how you should be able to search and retrieve and produce them, which you just hit on with the audit. Mm-hmm. So it's those three categories. What you're really going to a vendor for is to say, one, can I capture all of these? Here's my list. Can I capture all of these things? Very rarely, and this isn't an affront to vendors, very rarely when you give someone, 99 things on a list, is there a vendor that actually gets all 99 things?
Sure.
But you will find them covering the core things, email, instant messaging, or if it's relevant, things like Bloomberg or Thomson Reuters workstations or other chat tools that are specific to the industry. You'll find them covering the social media platforms in varying levels, anything from Facebook and Twitter on up to the full list of social tools that are out there. That's step one. You do want to ask if they can help you with your documentation, right? Documents and other data, videos, files, even audio files like a podcast. Do they do that broad sweep, or are they very vertical, focused on email and messaging? Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, you want to ask them, and this is where you can go to validate the rules that power everything, is 17A3 and 17A4 of the SEC rules, is what talks about things like worm storage, which is write once, read many, meaning once it's archived, it can't be deleted from the archive until the retention period is up.
And is the retention period 7 years? Is that correct?
That's the fallback. When you don't know the answer to the question, you can revert to 6 or 7 years, depending on who you're regulated by. But there are things like advertising and other communications that have shorter retention periods. The larger the firm, the more likely that you're using an archiver that allows you to set all those different categories up and have that at least semi-automated, because it can get massive and complex, as you can imagine, with millions and millions of files and messages.
Oh, sure.
For a smaller firm, it's important just to be able to retain the data and then understand the proper way to destroy the data after the retention period is passed, if you choose to do it. Some people keep it forever. Some people keep it and say, well, it's 6 years. If I'm allowed to delete it, I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to delete it the compliant way. And so you want to ask your vendors about that as well.
And I remember when I was coming into the industry and hearing some of these pieces, especially when I was starting my own firm and started digging into this, it's kind of amazing that we have these requirements. I'm not aware of any other industry that has such strict requirements, but I think the core of it is regulators want to be able to come in and just take a look at what you're telling people. They're going to do a search for the word guarantee for whatever reason. That is like the highlight word to be sure you've never guaranteed investment returns, because obviously we can't do that. But they are trying to protect consumers. It's frustrating, I know, to go out and set all this up, and it's a little expensive, to be honest, to archive all of this information, and not only archive it, but to your point earlier, be sure you're actually checking your archives, testing your archives, be sure everything is working the way it needs to. But that's kind of the core purpose of it. The one area I have gotten questions about is, what about, social media profiles and such that just can't be archived? So for instance, a lot of companies are getting into using Snapchat. It's actually becoming a pretty useful brand building, social media tool. I mean, what do you do as an advisor if there are social media profiles that you just can't get archived to? One, because the system's built to not allow it, or, just the vendors haven't caught up with Instagram or YouTube or whatnot.
Yeah, it's one of the least fun parts of my job when I give advice because I am a bleeding edge adopter. I usually pay the tax, as they call it, right? When I buy the product when it's first released. I actually bought the very first iPod, and my brother still laughs at me today that I paid $499 for that brick with the turn wheel and the click wheel. And
you can get an iPhone for that now.
I thought I was like the coolest cat in Ohio when I bought that in the early 2000s. So, I do pay the bleeding edge tax and I use these tools, but the challenge becomes for us in the industry, just from a risk management perspective, even for a very small emerging firm, is if you can't capture and prove what was said and done, you run the risk of someone having a communication that you can't produce. And an examiner can take you to the table on that and at least make you very uncomfortable. And so there are certain tools like WhatsApp or Snapchat that could be incredibly useful, but they actually don't even have APIs that anybody could code to without violating their terms of service.
Right. That's the whole point of some of those systems is to not allow archiving.
That's right. And so you have to think carefully about it. Certainly tools like YouTube, we used to integrate with YouTube at Arcovy. So that's been around for a while. And I think it's still a very powerful platform on the business front to use. And so you want to look at tools they don't necessarily have to be mature, but look at tools that are opening up the doors to archiving. Even if there's a cost, it may be worth the cost if that platform is important to you. Snapchat's a real tough one because we see brands outside of the industry that don't have the same regulations having a lot of success stories.
Yep.
And it's really painful to watch that when you could, as an emerging new planner, use this tool really effectively with your clients and you can't. And you have to have, you're a hip young advisor and you're talking to a hip young investor and saying, well, we're not allowed to do that here. It doesn't resonate.
Consumers don't understand. I mean,
that's right.
Are we really going to detail our archiving solution requirements to our clients? And we'll talk more about text messaging in particular. But I mean, just a client wants to text you and you have to say, oh, no, sorry, can't do that because it's been until very recently that basically we haven't had any technology to allow us to archive. So, I think that the tendency is just to say, well, forget it. I'm a small firm. No one's going to notice, or I'm just going to do it. And eventually the regulators will catch up. It's a dangerous line to run. I've certainly been guilty of pushing the envelope myself, but, always encourage folks to stay out of the gray area if you can, and definitely stay out of the black area when it's black and white.
Absolutely.
So, I know from my experience, I have usually ended up with one system that archives email, another system that archives social media, and then ended up selling my practice before I ever adopted any type of text message archiving. So could you just give us kind of a rundown? And obviously, if you use Outlook versus Gmail or Google Apps for your email, the archiving solution very well may be different. But could you just give us a list of some vendors that listeners should be looking at whenever they're evaluating just kind of the big players?
Sure. Well, I'll start in the social space. Obviously, my progeny, Arcovy, has lived on inside of Reg Ed and taken on its own life there. So that is a solution that's out there. For the smaller market, you've got tools like Secure My Social, Archive Social that work in the smaller spaces in the smaller and mid-sized markets. And you've got Hearsay Social and Actiance and Socialware working in the larger enterprise markets of financial services. Some of those tools might be very effective for a small practice, but they might not be approachable from a pricing perspective or a minimum user perspective. And then you have peripheral players. So they're in the email archiving space, but they also offer social. So firms like Global Relay and Smarsh and MessageWatcher all have integrations or support varying levels of social media archiving in that space. So that's kind of step one.
Okay.
When you go to the email side, it's a pretty familiar list for some, but there's two layers to it. So there's the industry players like Smarsh, Actiance, Global Relay, Proofpoint, MessageWatcher. Those are the common firms you hear thrown around, even among small and mid-sized firms who are trying to adopt an email archiving solution. Then you have, for the very small market, you have the ability, for example, to go to Google for Work and get their enterprise version. It's the unlimited version. So there's one that's $5 a month and one that's $10 a month when you're buying Google for Work. The $10 a month includes of vault and retention policies around email and communications. So that can be a very effective solution for a small practice that's standardizing itself on Google tools, because it gives you that effective capability to capture data. And the same exists in the Microsoft world in Office 365. Microsoft has evolved a bit. They used to only be available from an enterprise perspective to larger buyers. And now you can walk in and buy 1 or 2 seats of the enterprise solution of Office 365 for basically $1 or $2 more per month than Google and achieve the same level of tool set.
So as the compliance expert, in your non-legal opinion, do you think, does Google Vault meet all of the retention requirement and I guess kind of what you're looking for in email archiving?
It's funny. We talk about this a lot. It's almost like when you're having the Amazon Web Services discussion, which is a way to store data in the cloud using Amazon. They have certifications at Google for the Department of Defense, the federal government, for all of these different levels. The one thing they don't write in their literature is worm, WORM. And just that simple omission makes it very complicated for some advisors to be comfortable using it. So from a purist standpoint, if I was being, a purist from a constitutional perspective, I would say, no, it's not compliant because they don't use that word. But when you look at it technically, it's achieving the same level of storage and retention that you can get with an archiver. What it's missing is that great suite of tools that allows you to supervise and automate the review, search, and retrieval of data that you would get with a Message Watcher or Smarsh or Global Relay.
Okay, so I can breathe a sigh of relief because I have long advocated for Google Vault because in my non-compliance expert opinion, it, again, met the spirit of the law, not necessarily the letter of the law.
That's correct.
And for a solo firm, doing reviews of your own materials, maybe not all that necessary. But as you grow and as you have a larger firm, you've got 5 or 10 advisors, you're absolutely correct. I mean, you need a bigger enterprise level solution that's going to allow your CCO to do reviews of communications and be sure that everybody is up and up on what they're saying to clients. So, okay, so I can breathe a sigh of relief on that. So that's archiving. That's what we need to do to keep the regulators happy. So then we kind of start looking at, okay, what about our actual data and just good business practice when it comes to backups? I know I myself have deleted many files by accident, and we can talk about the difference between cloud-based and server-based. Servers crash. There's just lots of things that could happen. And so I guess, what do you tell advisors that are looking at backups and how to kind of design their system in a way that they're protected in the event of a worst-case scenario?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And one of the first places I start is where they store their business documents. And again, I happen to be a cloud proponent, but when it comes to compliance, I tend to be a little fickle in the number of tools that I'll recommend. So I'll give you a very candid example. I love Dropbox. It's one of my favorite tools that exists in the cloud world. However, when a firm that's regulated asks me, what should I use? I always go back to Box and Ignite. The reason being is they both offer a compliant edition that actually has the retention policies that match what you're doing with social data and email data with Box and Ignite. And so it allows you to have that sync functionality, clients on your tablet and phone. However, it also passes both the spirit and letter of the law when it comes to secured cloud storage. So for example, just like emails, you can set it so that when you have 1,000 documents in these various folders, someone can delete it. They no longer see it. It's no longer there, but you have a retention repository that actually maintains everything, both deleted and not deleted, and allows you to meet the retention requirements around cloud storage and security. So before I go to backup, I always talk to people about how you could structurally put step 1 of your backup in place by using a compliant cloud tool that syncs so that you have a local copy and a cloud copy. That's level 1 of the backup. Level 2 of the backup is then taking all of that and putting it in a third location, so that if you fail, your computer fails, and Box fails, that you have that redundant restore. So in essence, you have 3 copies, right? You have your local, it's synced to your cloud storage, and then you have a backup that backs up the backup. And
Sure.
it's actually a really effective way for especially even the smallest business or even businesses up to 15 to 20 people can very effectively manage storage and backup using a solution like that.
Now, I know that sounds a little overwhelming, but I have set this up a couple of times with various organizations, and it's really not that complicated. I mean, there's some pretty good automated systems now that will automatically back up a box, or, if you choose to use a Dropbox or something like that, but we'll back up box, 3 times a day, every day. And then if something happens to your system, something happens to the box system, now suddenly all of your documents are sitting on a third backup at Amazon servers or Google servers, some of the largest server farms in the world. Again, to your point, what are the odds that your computer goes down right about the same time box goes down? Maybe low, but if that ever happens, you will wish you had paid the $8 a month for a program like Backupify, or I use Spanning for backing up Google Drive documents, things like that. Do you have some specific solutions when it comes to cloud-based backups that you prefer?
Well, one footnote for the folks who may have their heads in their hands when I said that about Dropbox, I've seen many successful implementations of Dropbox in the industry. It's just simply that you have to add one more step. You can add a tool like Boxcryptor. There's a couple of tools that are out there that have a big user base that allow you to further secure Dropbox to meet financial requirements. It's not that Dropbox is inherently bad or insecure. It's just that the method that they use isn't the extra step if you're going to put client data in the cloud versus a Box or Ignite. So you can use an extra tool. And I know firms, even firms that have 5 or 6 advisors with support staff who use Dropbox, they just need to get an additional layer on there. On the backup front, there are a couple of ways to do backups. My favorite for the small market, and I'll admit my bias because I've recommended both Mozy and Carbonite. I really like Carbonite. I'm not paid by them. I'm not a spokesperson, but it is so in the background and just runs. And you can hand pick your specific things that you want to back up, or you can say back up everything. And it's just a very effective tool. Mozy can accomplish that. There is an additional tool out there for the smaller market, iDrive, that has just been getting raves from outlets like PC Magazine, which still commands respect from a review perspective. And what's interesting about iDrive is they include hardware. So you can actually get a terabyte drive on your desk and then a client on your computers, and it goes both to your desk and the cloud. Now, that may be overkill if you're using Box or Dropbox and you already have local and remote, but it does create a scenario where it's highly unlikely that you won't be able to recover a backup.
So I'm curious then, with all of these backups, how often are you recommending that advisors test these backup policies and things like that? And I guess this would be in your policy and procedure manual, but I mean, what's best business practices with all of these various backups?
Sure. I recommend at least, once a year at absolute minimum. I would think twice a year you are testing to make sure that you can restore a backup from your backup solution. So not just go to Box and sync, but actually, or some other tool, go to your pure backup and say, restore this file or restore this folder to this location. You can actually restore to your desktop with all of these cloud tools. They allow you to override putting everything back where it was and just say restore to a folder on my desktop. And just validating that you can do that is really critical to ensuring that when crisis happens, you're not going to go up there and it says, I'm sorry, we've had problems with your backup for the past 90 days, so we can restore from last November.
Because if nothing else, despite regulations, trying to redo 90 days worth of work is a nightmare. That would be horrible.
Yeah, you would have to reconstruct it from emails, and it would be pretty complex.
Oh, that would be a nightmare.
To do that.
So when we're looking at backups, we're talking a lot about cloud data, and I personally think that everything needs to be in the cloud at this point because I have had server crashes. I've had my laptop crash just randomly. So I have been scared into putting everything online. But some folks are looking, they still have desktop-based software. So even if they're storing all their data in the cloud, they still end up with stuff on their computer. So I was actually under the impression Carbonite was just for computer backups. I didn't realize they were doing cloud backup as well. Do all of those systems do both, or do you need a separate system that backs up your hardware versus a system that just backs up in the cloud?
Well, the beauty of the cloud backup is that cloud copy is local. So if you want to back up Box, for example, or Dropbox, and you're syncing to your computers, you make sure that Carbonite is backing up your entire computer every night, and you're always having a running copy of what's actually stored in the cloud. Because that sync occurs even when you allow your employees to edit files in the browser, like you can with some cloud tools. Both Dropbox and Box introduced Microsoft integration where you're in Dropbox and you hit edit, and it opens it up in Word Online. Even if you're not a subscriber, it allows you to edit a document. So it's a really nice feature, but that's where you're planning on deploying these tools means you need to understand how sync works to make sure it's syncing properly. And then that your backup tool of choice allows you to make sure that you select all the folders. All of these tools also have a slightly higher expense. You can include a server or servers. So if you do keep a local server, you can actually back up the server as well.
Yeah, and I really hope, many of our listeners are going to be starting their own firms. Hopefully none of you are enticed into buying a server at this point, but there are a lot of firms out there that still have them, and there's a lot of server-based software that you can install. Many of the industry-specific softwares require local installation. If you don't want to put it on your computer, you do have to put it on the server.
Sure, and there are a couple of options out there that I still respect a great deal that are local-based hardware backup that then have a cloud plugin or a way to help you feel confident. And so, many small firms, doesn't mean that they don't have any money. They may be willing to invest a few $1,000s if it means it makes them comfortable backing up locally in-house. And I wouldn't call it a server, but I would, recommend folks take a look at Drobo, which is Drobo. It's an investment. It's not off the rails, but it's an investment. It's not like buying several $100s worth of Carbonite. It's a couple $1,000, but you can have a local, very robust backup drive that allows you to do something a little old school. You can pull out a drive and stick it in a safe. It's made for people just to plug things in, like unplugging and plugging an outlet, where you don't need a technician. And also Barracuda still offers a device you can just turn on in your office, and it backs up whatever you tell it to back up. So for those who maybe there's a special need or a special use case where they have to do it locally, there is an option. For a small firm that has a limited budget, that's where I would point back to the iDrive that I mentioned. It behaves like Carbonite, but it includes a local hardware-based drive that you can plug into your computer. I actually have one in the office here that I play around with just to evaluate that service.
So iDrive, I'm assuming that's from Apple, or did they just steal the letter I?
They just got on the I train and called it iDrive. And it's been heavily reviewed and respected by a lot of the tech blogs. So it's very inexpensive, a couple of $100s at most, even for a firm with multiple people. So it's an interesting scenario to consider if you're on a limited budget.
Fair enough. And this is more best business practice. I'm not sure the regulators have ever said, must keep your, financial statements archived for 7 years or anything like that. So it's not so much for when the regulators come in, but it is when a folder gets deleted, a template gets overwritten, your computer crashes. There's just so many scenarios and things that could happen. It's just really, really nice to have an automated backup system. And again, to your point, a backup of the backup. So if you're storing in the cloud, that's similar to storing on your desktop in terms of you still need a backup of that. So just because you're storing it in a different place from your actual hard drive doesn't mean you don't need to back it up. So any other recommended systems, I guess, when it comes to backup that you recommend? Again, some of this is just so industry specific. So if you're using, Google and Google Drive, then obviously the system may be a little different from others. But any other, vendors that you recommend listeners take a look at?
The big thing here is not so much a vendor. This almost ends up being a segue into data protection. But one of the challenges today is not just viruses, but malware or ransomware. And if that infects a computer and gets into your backup, then when an event happens that potentially puts you in crisis where you need to replace machines or erase machines, and it's in you keep restoring the problem, right? You keep recreating the
Right.
problem. One of the most critical things, and we've gotten kind of numb to it because we think it's just running all the time. It's really critical for even the smallest firm, and especially Apple users, of which I am one. And I will tell you, I run a malware and antivirus on my Mac, and people laugh all the time. And I said, it is only a matter of time before someone figures out an effective way to hit a lot of Macs. I mean,
and they
yes,
did recently, right? Like
did.
it was like the first big hit against Apple servers.
That's right. And so it's only a matter of time. Apple becomes more and more mainstream, and we plug our phones into our computers all the time and our tablets to do various things. It's only a matter of time before someone figures out that equation. The bad guys always get a couple of strikes before we put up the walls and change the game. So I highly recommend everybody just take a fresh look. Am I running the correct, good security suite on my computer, on my devices, so that I'm protecting what's being stored and synced back and forth from the cloud and what gets into my backups? If you have this equation right, and you get ransomware or you get attacked or somehow compromised, you can literally just go to a tech and say, here, will you please just erase this machine completely, or even take out the drive, put a drill through it, put a new hard drive in it. I'm going to install Carbonite and hit restore and connect my Dropbox or Box account and hit sync. You can do that if you've got a good security layer, a good backup layer, and your storage sorted out. It sounds overwhelming, but you can go through a recipe and really put the pieces in place and just feel confident that you're able to respond in a crisis.
Yeah. And I know what listeners are thinking, oh, this is kind of overkill or whatnot, but you've seen many more than I have those situations where people really wish that they had done something a little differently. And I'll give you an example. One of the first firms I worked at, we actually we were doing a disaster test on our server, which is what we were told to do. We went through that process, and I don't know all the technical things of what happened. It was right before I got there, but a bug basically crashed our server in the middle of a disaster test. So it went from a test to reality. And that's when we found out that our backups weren't as good as we thought they were. And we got put in a situation where we were testing, and we would have discovered that had we been allowed to complete the test. But it's a really scary thing. And basically our firm, we limped along for the next 6 months trying to get caught back up. And it's just a really hard place to be in just from a purely business standpoint.
I had a call in a recent week from a firm that was attacked, and they had a lot of pieces in place, but they had a couple of gaps. But most importantly, they had the right pieces in place for a security suite on their laptops and for their backup. And that's the biggest peace of mind there. They were able to just, in this case, out of pure paranoia, they literally threw away the machines. They drilled them and had them destroyed, and they literally went out and bought 9 laptops.
Basically went office space on their laptops.
Yeah, they just said, look, we don't even, because nobody could figure out how deep it was. I mean, it was pretty sophisticated. So it could have been in I don't want to go off the rails technically, but it could have been in the BIOS or cache or some other hardware infecting exercise. And they literally just said, out of sheer paranoia, we're going to write this off, throw away 9 computers, have them shredded, and restore it to new computers. So with a few bumps and bruises, they were up in 21 days with no hassle. That's not bad. I mean, they weren't
that's
dark
not bad
for 21 days, but in 21 days, they were business as usual. And that's not bad.
No, it's not. Like I said, I've seen much longer.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the compliance side of things with archiving, the actual backup of data, which again, I view as good business practice, but it really is necessary. And we're kind of hinting at the encryption side of things, the actual data security. And I've always looked at this in a couple forms. One is access point, so whether it's literally opening up your phone and logging in or logging into your computer, and then it's transmission of data. So sending, data across unsecured Wi-Fi, things like that. And then again, it's encryption in the cloud or wherever you're storing your data, so that if they get hacked, so if you're using Box and Box gets hacked, what's to keep people out of your system? So what are best business practices in terms of entry point security? Because I think I would guess mobile phones are probably a hotbed of weakness in most people's situation. But what are you seeing there just in terms of best business practice and just things to be aware of?
Sure. And it is the highest risk because it's the true convergence of personal and professional. Even in the largest enterprise, it's not just to the small market. It is absolutely where personal meets professional. There's still a population of people in the largest companies that carry around two phones, but that's largely going away.
Yeah.
So you do have to think very carefully because you're always going to put personal apps on and commingle with professional apps. Number one and first and foremost is I still find people who just swipe to unlock or don't have a lock on their phone. And you just absolutely must lock your phone. I know it's inconvenient when you're driving. That means you shouldn't be picking your phone up while you're driving. Use Siri or Google Now to talk to it. But you should definitely have a lock to unlock your phone. And if you're in deep concern, there are security suites that you can buy. They're not all cumbersome. So a tool like Lookout, which you can go Google Lookout Mobile Security. It's a couple of bucks a month for an individual to put this on their phone, whether it's iOS or Android, and have a security layer that looks at malware, that looks at privacy risk in apps, and looks at viruses. It's a nice little tool. Trend Micro and Symantec both offer mobile security suites, not just for big companies, but also for small business. So when you get to the 5, 10, 15 people range and up, you can start looking at these suites as a potential tool for putting on your phones. And then you certainly want to take advantage of, since we live on these phones. I mean, I have my phone in my pocket at all times unless I'm sleeping. So I always have it. So I live with two-factor authentication on almost everything since you have that phone. And that means that you're really creating a couple of extra layers for people to get into your laptop, which we'll talk about next, or even just to get into apps on your phone where you can use extra security. I highly recommend it.
So two-factor authentication, tell listeners what that means.
Sure. That's where when you're logging into something, whether you're using it on your mobile device or any browser, you put your username and password in and you get a new screen that says, hey, we've just sent you a text message with a PIN number. Type that PIN number in here to complete logging in. And what that does is if someone gets your Facebook or some other application's login and password, they also have to have your phone in their pocket, be able to unlock your phone and read the message, which is, if you read between the lines, that means that you should think carefully about the notifications you allow to be fully printed on your screen while the phone is locked.
That's a really good point, because I can see whenever Google sends me that message from I have two-factor authentication on Google for work email, and it comes through, but it comes through on top of my phone. Anybody could see it if they were holding my phone. They wouldn't have to unlock it.
So if they somehow figured out, well, all I got to do is pick up Alan's phone and make sure it's powered up. Even if it's locked, I'm going to get the text message and be able to unlock his account if I have the username and password. So that's a pretty rare scenario.
Sure.
But I always tell people that's a Starbucks scenario. If you go to Starbucks twice a week to work, there's people that know you're there twice a week to work. They may pay a lot more attention than you think. And your laptop or your tablet and your phone could just walk off one day when you go up for a refill. And it's been reported many times. Airports are good for that as well. So it's just something to keep in mind. You can have a notification come in, but it's best not to have it fully print the notification if you're using two-factor authentication.
Makes sense. All right. So that's mobile security. What about just when it comes to computers in general? Any recommendations there beyond just having a strong password?
Sure. I always like to tell people, just think budgetary. Unless you're a bigger company, if you buy a PC with Windows 10 Professional on it, it has to be professional. It's worth buying because there's a lot of functionality there. Or a Mac computer, no special version, you have built-in hard disk encryption that you can turn on at that point. That gives you a special key that you need to deposit, put away somewhere. Microsoft allows you to store it in your OneDrive account or on any secure digital location. And Apple can do the same thing with the whole iCloud sync. And Apple just recently upgraded iCloud security in the past few days. I mean, what that means is if your computer is either powered off or locked, meaning you've walked away and it's gone to sleep and it's locked itself, and both Macs and PCs can be told to lock after 5 or 10 minutes, and I walk up and take your machine and disappear, you will have zero data loss as long as there's a password, because they will have to erase the hard drive. So what they've done is they've stolen a nice computer. What they have not done is stolen your data. the key is that it has to lock, right? So I always tell
Right.
people, set it to lock after 5 or 10 minutes. It's another one of those inconveniences. I hear the protests about, why do I have to unlock my phone? Why do I have to unlock my computer? It's planning for the worst case scenario.
It is, but it just happens too often that, somebody picks up your backpack and goes walking. And, if somebody grabbed my bag in an airport, it would have my laptop, potentially my phone and my iPad in it. There's a lot of entry points into—
And your passport.
There you go. There's a lot of entry points into the data.
That's right.
And you mentioned working at Starbucks. This is another area that we get a lot of questions around. Okay, everything's locked down, but what about transmission of data? If you're plugged into your own Ethernet cord at work, you don't have a lot to worry about. But if you're using unsecured Wi-Fi at an airport or even on an airplane itself or sitting in Starbucks, there's a risk there that people can grab your data as it's being transmitted. So any recommendations there in terms of best practices or systems to help secure data transmission?
Absolutely. You should consider public Wi-Fi like taking your journal and your wallet or your purse and dumping it out on the street and just inviting people to take a look. That's what it's like. So it's very efficient and very helpful. You definitely just use a personal VPN. I'm not the first to speak about these. This has been discussed for several years, at least 3 years. There are a couple of very good ones in the Mac world. So if you're on an iPad or an iOS device or even a Mac, you can buy Cloak VPN, getcloak.com, and you can have one account and it covers all your iOS devices. And what it does is it encrypts the connection between you and the internet so that you're creating a little bit of a tunnel so that people who are snooping on the Starbucks or the airport or other free Wi-Fi cannot access it. There's a caveat for those of you who are like me, who absolutely love and adore Netflix, is while you're on VPN, Netflix does not work. The reason they're doing that, this won't be a too much of a rabbit hole, but they're doing that to protect from people using a VPN because they're in Japan. They want to watch an American movie. They're in America.
Right.
And they want to watch a movie in Europe that's only available on that store. They use a VPN and say, I'm in Hamburg, and magically the movie appears. They're trying to police that because of the licensing rights. I won't say any more about it, but it is a caveat for those who love Netflix. Certainly while you're working, you can have the VPN on. And then if you want to sit back and watch Netflix, just kick the VPN off. Just make sure you're not doing anything else that's transmitting
stuff
data
at the same time.
Right. The other two that I really like, and I love saying the one because it's just got a funny name. It's called HMA, which means hide my ass. And that is how they sell it. If you go to that on hidemyass.com, you will find a great VPN there. I've used both of those. I like both of those. HMA works across all the different devices and platforms. So they're much more open architecture, very good for PCs, very easy to use, a very minor learning curve when you first set it up. There's a lot of help screens. It's not, I don't want to push anyone away from it. It just takes 5 or 10 minutes to figure it out, and you'll be up and running. And then there's one on Android specifically that I have played with and I have yet to hear anything bad about. It's called VPN One Click. So that should give you 3 to go poke around and look. If nothing else, if you can encrypt your hard drive and get it on your phone or your devices, one of those VPNs, just to make sure, because that's when you're hitting so many open Wi-Fis, when you're on the train, on the plane, commuting, walking. That's the biggest risk there.
Makes sense. And then the final piece that I hear from folks is, if I'm going to upload to Dropbox or Box, I think Box has some built-in encryption, whereas things like Dropbox, people are worried about it. You mentioned Boxcryptor earlier. Is that enough to secure documents in a place like Google Drive or, Dropbox? Because we've heard the horror stories of, Dropbox accidentally, basically made it so no one had a password for 12 hours. So anyone could have logged in. So do you recommend encrypting all documents that are being uploaded to a system like that?
I do on Dropbox. I really do recommend that you get an extra encryption layer. Either you encrypt them locally on your PC, for example, the same tool, the BitLocker tool that you can encrypt your hard drive with. You can right click on a folder and encrypt a folder and then put it in your Dropbox folder so that Dropbox doesn't have the key to unlock it. I highly recommend it. And certainly if you're using a tool like Box or Ignite, you would want to use their native encryption settings to make sure that you have security layers on your documents. It's a constant battle. I'm suffering along with you because I was talking to a coworker this morning and he said, I got a notice that that some data was compromised. They're replacing a card. They've given me credit protection for a year. I said, I have 8 of those in my files. I've got Target, Home Depot, Lowe's,
Yep.
Adobe. I mean, the list goes on, and I'm not growing numb to them, but I'm continuing to think through how to protect myself. Especially, you always paint a bullseye on yourself when you speak about it. So I definitely do practice what I preach and try to evaluate different tools that will help me stay secure.
You know what I'd love to see? I'd love to see someone hack an open Wi-Fi channel at a place like a conference, just to show what that looks like. Because, we hear people say like, oh, people could grab your data that's being transmitted on open Wi-Fi at Starbucks. You can make it really easy and name your own little network, Starbucks free. And it's not actually Starbucks, it's actually a hacker. It would be kind of fun to show advisors what that even looks like and just how easy it is. Because I have seen that before and it's amazing, really.
Who's good at it is anonymous, but I wouldn't invite them to do it because that could be dangerous.
I would rather not bring them out to our conference. That'll be a good invite. So in addition to all, archiving email, archiving social media, the big question that advisors have been asking, especially lately, is archiving text messaging. And this is a really complicated piece because clients sometimes will just text us. I've always used voice over kind of internet-based phone systems like Ring Central or Jive. And, text messages just come through automatically. So if somebody texts my work number, I get it on my mobile. What are you seeing in terms of just systems to archive text messaging? And obviously you work at Mobile Guard, so you're welcome to promote them as well as anybody else that's in this space that's doing good work.
Sure. Yeah. In full disclosure, I certainly work for a text message archiving solution. So Mobile Guard archives text messages a couple of different ways. There are basically 3 common approaches, and we do all 3. The legacy approach, the traditional approach, was on Android and BlackBerry. You could put an app on it. And what it did is it sat there and listened. And it said, oh, Alan or Blane is using the native messaging app on Android or BlackBerry. So I'm going to record those text messages and send them back to the archiving base to store them. That's the traditional way. Another common way that you see today is what they call an over-the-top app. And for anybody that has ever installed Skype on their phone, that's an over-the-top app. So it allows you to make real phone calls, Skype calls, chat messages, but also real text messages, and then finally video. So that's what an over-the-top app does. And there are business-oriented over-the-top apps that serve different markets. Mobile Guard has one called Secure Chat. CellTrust, Tiger Text serves the healthcare market. And then there's apps like Silent Circle, which is a kind of an anti-compliance. That's an encrypted locked system where you can't back it up, but it is an over-the-top app that allows for messaging.
Even a system like Google Hangouts is over the top, but I'm not sure that it's providing the right security that you need, like Skype.
That's correct. So in fact, most people, when you go into Google Apps for Work, you're getting a better security layer around your business account in the Google chat than you would just using your Gmail chat. I'm not suggesting the security is lower, but they're guarding your business in this case versus just saying, here's a free Google account on our main servers. So you do get an extra layer of business security when you pay for Google. The same goes for Microsoft. You can pay for Office 365, you get Skype for Business. What's beautiful about that is that also supports talking to regular Skype people. So for a financial advisor or planner, you can have Skype for Business and have that security layer, but you can still invite and connect with people who just use Skype only.
Makes
sense.
It's
a really nice feature. And then the over-the-top apps that you'll find for businesses for archiving are related to being able to also capture text messages. However, it's tough to just go out and lead in the market and say, here, install this app and stop using all the native tools that you know how to use.
Can't use iMessage ever again. Use our app.
Right. So what's unique in the market today, and I'm not just self-promoting, but Mobile Guard currently, for the time being, it won't be for long, we currently are the only one that offers a carrier solution in the US, which means with no software on your iPhone, your SMS and your MMS messages can be archived through the carriers back to the archiving solution. The caveat is you turn iMessage off. You still use the Messages app on your phone, same app, but all the bubbles are green instead of the blue bubbles you get with iMessage. And we now know from the San Bernardino FBI equation why iMessage should be turned off, because it is encrypted and can't be archived. It can't be unlocked.
Oh, interesting. I had not caught that. I knew the phone couldn't be unlocked. I didn't realize the iMessages were also causing
the
an
iMessages
issue.
are encrypted in such a way that Apple can't read those messages, so they can't provide them to companies or to the government. So that's a truly closed messaging protocol. And so literally 99.9% of the companies we work with, they disable iMessage. It doesn't change the app you use. It just makes sure that all messaging is only SMS and MMS.
And I know, as a solo advisor, that isn't as complicated. And I know as a larger advisor, it gets challenging to tell your employees like, hey, I'm going to archive every text message you send across your phone, and it does push the case that if your employees are concerned about, you going in and reading their personal text messages, maybe they need to get a secondary phone, one for business and one for personal. But
there really is a use case for that, to be honest, Alan. And even in small businesses with 2, 3, 4, 5 people, we find cases where people say, you know what? We don't want to have this argument because we also are private citizens, even if you're a manager or an owner, and you do have personal communications that you may not want archived. And so they go out and get a 5-phone account from Verizon or AT&T or Sprint or T-Mobile, and they say, here's your new iPhone or here's your new Android, whatever they prefer. Here's your new phone. I get to see everything on this phone, right? I get to archive your messaging, your inbox, your email, your phone logs. So this is your work phone. If you'd like your own phone, you're free to use it. Just don't use it for work. And then there's policy put in place. Large companies do that a lot. There's still more than 60% of companies in the large space that provide what are called corporate liable phones. They buy it and hand it to you when you walk in the door.
Like you said earlier, it's such a challenge when it comes to just all these different components. But sometimes it's painful and it just is. It's just a reality that you may have to cut off iMessage, or you're going to have to use a separate app, and you basically have to disable all your text messaging anyway. I know the poor man's version, and I'm not sure you maybe you'll speak to this better. The poor man's version that I have promoted is that Google Vault now, which we believe to be good enough for email, will grab all of your Google Voice communications, meaning that if you set up a Google Voice number, which is free, and you text from that number to and from that number, all of those would be captured in Vault, which may be good enough. Now, if they text your cell number, it doesn't capture. It's only going to capture, if it goes to your business number, but maybe that's a step one, and then start evaluating some of these other systems like Mobile Guard in order to start capturing everything, especially as you start having more employees, because you can only have Google Voice on one phone. So that's not a long-term solution.
Well, and another poor man's solution is, quite candidly, if you're very consistent and disciplined about it, if you physically plug your iPhone into your computer and use iTunes to do the backup versus the iCloud, both will back up your messages, including iMessages. They're just not in a way where you can get them to archive them, to grab them and put them in an archive place. But you can plug it in and create encrypted backups of your phone and literally store them in a folder that gets swept by a backup tool like Carbonite or iDrive. And that would be the bare bones minimum for a solo practitioner, with an iPhone, or with Google, you can do it with Android and iPhone if you're using Google Voice. You just have to be very consistent and very committed to using that as a solo practitioner, and then you can find a solution that way. The other way may be to get in with build a large group out of a small group. We see that in the government space where 30 or 40 cities that are very small group together and say, hey, can we buy this for 30 or 40 cities like a customer? And then that's a way that they're solving for the problem, because each individual little town or township doesn't have the budget. So you can certainly be creative, but if nothing else, make sure you're plugging it in, whether it's Android or iPhone or Windows Phone for that matter. Make sure you're enabling the backups, because that will save your messaging. At least you can produce it for an examiner, even if it's not in the right storage format.
Makes sense. Well, Blane, thank you so much for being on. I know that this is overwhelming for listeners because there's so many different components, but this is really, really important, and is honestly, it's just the cost of doing business, especially because we live in a world where we have access to a lot of just highly sensitive data. A simple tax return has basically everything a hacker would need to grab social security number, address, date of birth, name to wreak havoc on a client's life. So we do have to be very cognizant of some of the pieces here. So our show notes will be filled with lots of resources and links around. But thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your expertise on these various topics.
Absolutely. And if there's any confusion or really complex follow-on, I'd be glad to maybe put a blog post together for the network.
That'd
that's
be fantastic.
Helpful as a follow-up to this.
It would. And if you would, you can give a shout out to your soon to be newly launched or relaunched podcast. Where can listeners find, because you have an entire podcast dedicated to this topic?
Sure. It's called The Digital Well. It's by me, Blane Warrene, and I am rebooting it in 2016 here as I've got my new footing, and they can just find it at blanewarrene.com.
Perfect. And we'll link to that in the show notes. So thanks again for taking the time to be on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Alan. And hello to everybody in the network. Congratulations on the great growth.
Now, I know we moved through a ton of information in just an hour, but I wanted to be sure we showcase just all the various areas that you need to consider when it comes to protecting yourself and your clients in the digital age. It takes a little additional thought and preparation and occasional testing throughout the year, but it's definitely doable. Now, remember to join our VIP community to be able to ask XYPN members, guests on the podcast, Kitsis and myself questions, as well as interact with other members of the VIP community to get their perspectives at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Thanks again for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.